Okay, welcome everyone to the first episode of the Two Words podcast with my friend Dan Hartley. How are you doing, Dan?
Hey Juan, all good. Happy New Year. All is well here. Super excited. This is a first of many, I'm sure. Can't wait to get this started.
Yeah, well, I have the feeling that this is a project that has been brewing for quite some time now. And I guess we reckon that the new year was the best time to finally drop it for some reason. So actually for the audience who are listening to us, we're filming this right on the back of New Year's Eve. So Dan, I'll say a few words before I let you maybe introduce yourself briefly, and then we can dive straight into the agenda.
Yeah, sounds great.
Right. So in a nutshell, we are two guys working and living in London. And actually what's funny is that although we are online, and this will be for the most part an online podcast, we live together in the same house since last year. And the reason why we decided to start this podcast is because we used to have very interesting conversations at home where we would very well spend hours speaking in our living room. And I think like every group of friends, we thought, yeah, we should definitely record a podcast. But yet, Dan, I don't want to spend too much time introducing every single thing. So do you want to say a few words before we get into the agenda for today? Maybe we can say a bit about ourselves or backgrounds.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Juan. So I think great, introduction, and it's very much true. I think it's very much one of those arguably intrusive thoughts. We do have really interesting conversations, and that will always be the case. I think it's now we think they're worth an audience and people would enjoy it. So yeah, no, Juan,
it's a bold statement.
Well, we'll find out. Well, let us know what you think. But yeah, no, Juan works in strategy consulting, and I work for a consumer goods company in finance. So we both, have quite interesting, quite financial, quite economics related fields. But generally, we're quite curious people about the world. Juan's got a background in engineering. I studied business, but we also went to the same uni. So that's what kind of brings us together as well. So we've known each other for a while. As a result, I think we're interested in quite a lot of different things. And I think that's where this platform is a great way for us to engage with some of those discussions. People, a young Londoner working in a corporate job, just kind of experiences and thinks about and discusses with people or wants to know more about. I think that's what we're excited to share.
Yeah, what Dan won't tell you is he's a bit of a finance wizard. I'm so anything's finance and economics. It'll be Dan who I hope takes the lead on those things. I have more of a technical background, but I do work in consulting. So yeah, I'm sure we will have plenty of time to talk a bit about ourselves in future episodes and a bit about our industries. I think that would be interesting for the audience as well. But why don't we get started? So the way that we thought would be good to start us off, also since we're recording this on January 1st, it hits different, right? We're now in 2025, and so we thought, let's prepare 3 predictions for 2025 that we think are gonna come to fruition. And so, Dan, why don't we start with you? What are your top 3 predictions? Maybe you can start with your first one, and then I'll do my bit.
Yeah, no, sounds great. So I think something that we've discussed, something that's been very exciting, something I've heard on a lot of other platforms or podcasts, dinner table conversations, is the world of quantum computing, right? There have been some significant breakthroughs in 2024, and I'll let Juan explain it a bit more because he's got a very good explanation of what that is and what exactly goes into quantum computing as a whole and how to think about it. But basically, we've seen a huge amount of experimentation. We've seen the Willow quantum chip by Google being a huge focus in the press. And I think that's going to be a really exciting area into 2025, where we'll see continuous experimentation with quantum. We'll continue to see some significant breakthroughs like we've seen with Willow. And that will be a very exciting field, because it actually ties into so many other parts of the world in terms of technical innovation, the AI agenda, and so much more. But having said that, I would also say that there is a large amount of work still to be done when it comes to quantum, and that because we've got this Willow chip which does quantum computing, that doesn't mean that next year we're going to see this crazy sudden, ridiculous tsunami wave of everything we've ever known. I think it's more, it won't be that fast, but it'll be a very exciting time for us as a human race, basically.
So do you think in 2025 we will see quantum computers that are capable of breaking traditional RSA encryption? Because I know that's a hot topic. I have my own opinion. I think we're still far away, and this whole Willow thing and the quantum chip has been blown out of proportion in a sense. I think 2025 will certainly be, in a sense, even scary with some of the breakthroughs that we're going to see, with the focus that will be put on quantum computing from tech giants like from IBM to even Google. Sundar himself has spoken about this, and it is clear that it is a top priority at Google. But yeah, I'm curious to see, because also some people are now afraid that quantum computing will be able to break not RSA encryption, but the encryption that is the backbone of Bitcoin as well, right? So imagine if that comes with currently, as we speak, Bitcoin between $90,000 and $100,000 per coin. How's that going to affect? Because I know a lot of companies can switch, and they are switching to quantum-resistant encryption formats. But I'm not too sure if we could do the same thing with Bitcoin. Maybe someone in the audience listening can shine some light. But yeah, definitely I see how quantum will be a priority. I didn't have that one in my list, actually. So interesting that you bring it up.
Yeah. So I mean, I think on your point there, in terms of RSA encryption and just generally as a holistic piece, any sort of cybersecurity threats that might arise because of the use of quantum, in terms of our whole foundation of cybersecurity and the way we've built all sorts of digital assets, if that is something like cryptocurrency or standard, I guess, validation checks like an RSA, is that it really relies on a computer thinking the way that it currently does classical computers. So of course we're going to see huge amounts of potential threats with the rise of quantum computing, but like all computing technologies that have ever been developed, it's a kind of the chicken and the egg problem, where effectively you want to be developing softwares and assets that are quantum safe or quantum level, the equivalent of a Bitcoin, or perhaps, finding a way to make Bitcoin have a quantum element or can run on quantum computers would be something in the, I think, medium to long future. I don't think that's something short term to worry about, but it definitely is a valid concern, because how can you rely on effectively ways of thinking in terms of computers and the way that they communicate and respond to one another if the fundamental way that a computer thinks is going to change with the introduction of quantum? But again, it's quite experimental at this stage, and there's no way that a fraudster or a hacker at this point in time would ever get their hands on Willow as a chip, right? It's a huge, crazy experimental project by a company like Google. That's not going to be a reality for somebody who owns a bunch of Bitcoin today, but it might be in 10 years' time or 5. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Maybe since we're getting into quantum, let's dive a bit more in depth. Because so for the audience, let me just briefly explain for everyone listening what quantum computers are about and how they work. Because I think a common misconception that I see time and time again is that quantum computers are just technically superior forms of computing than classical computers, right? And this is just not true. In fact, quantum computers are fundamentally different types of systems. And if you think about it, so classical computers work by turning bits in binary states, right? So zeros and ones. And unlike classical computers, quantum computers use something that are called qubits, right? Or quantum bits. And they use the fundamental properties of quantum mechanics, and some of these properties are superposition and entanglement. Actually, there's a funny anecdote about entanglement that I'll get into in a second. But essentially, how they leverage superposition, for example, is that unlike a classical bit that can be either a 0 or a 1, a quantum bit or a qubit can be a superposition of 0 and 1 at the same time, right? And so this ability, if you couple it with entanglement, which fundamentally means that two particles or two qubits or multiple qubits can be in an entangled state. And what that means is that their quantum properties are intertwined, right? No matter where these particles are in the universe. And this ability is what allows quantum computers to perform multiple calculations in parallel and essentially run different types of algorithms, quantum algorithms, and then you get into more complicated things like quantum Fourier transforms, which are one of those quantum algorithms that is used to break RSA traditional encryption, and we can get into that as well. But I wanted to say just this funny anecdote from Einstein. If we think about Einstein's work and relativity and, 100 years later, almost everything holds true, right? However, one of the topics that Einstein really struggled with was actually quantum mechanics. And he was always trying to refute quantum mechanics theories. And one day he actually sent out a letter or put a public statement out saying that quantum mechanics couldn't be true because the maximum speed at which light travels in the universe, as we know, is the speed of light, right? And that's the maximum speed at which you can transport information. So we know that space itself can expand at a faster rate than the speed of light, but it carries no information. And so in Einstein's mind, he thought, well, quantum mechanics cannot be possible because, remember, entanglement means that two particles, no matter where they are in the universe, and they could be millions of light years away, their properties, their quantum states are intertwined. And so what that means is that because there's this coupling of properties, if you intercept the quantum state of one of those particles, you would then know what the other particle's state is at that precise time. And that would violate the maximum speed at which you can transport information in the universe, which is the speed of light. And so, he used that to say, quantum mechanics cannot be possible. Later on, it was proved that fundamental property of the universe and of quantum mechanics is actually not transporting any information. But it's just, a funny little anecdote. But yeah, anyway, so
I like that. I like that, Juan. That's a good one.
So that's essentially, that's how quantum computers work. And I think there's been a lot of hype with this Willow advancement. It is really an advancement. I wrote a Substack post about it. And in every single headline that I saw Willow, the new quantum computer by Google that can perform a calculation in 5 minutes that would take a classical computer 10 septillion years to complete, right? Which is, 10 septillion years is around 10 to the 25th power years to complete. And that is fundamentally misleading because quantum computers are just fundamentally different types of computers than classical machines. And so it's not that they can perform calculations that normal computers do in 5 minutes in 10 septillion years, is that they can, because of their quantum properties, perform calculations in a different way that is a lot more efficient. However, there are many, many different types of algorithms that a quantum computer would be very inefficient at when in comparison to a classical computer. And so that's why I said when I wrote this article that comparing or trying to judge if a quantum computer is better or more powerful than a classical computer is like trying to judge if a fork is better than a knife.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Juan. I think something also for the audience to understand a bit better is on exactly what makes the two difference on the superposition part, right? Which is if you imagine 2 bits or 2 qubits, you can have 0 or 1s with 2 bits. So you can have effectively, in a normal computer at one moment in time, one sequential sort of, I guess, map. It's either 1 0, 0 1, 0 0, 1 1 in terms of the actual ways of looking at the bits and the way a classical computer would think. Whilst a quantum computer, what would make it different is that it has those different bits are effectively all zeros and ones simultaneously. So you can have, in theory, 4 sequential calculations going on. And then you also have the whole aspect of all of the particles being intertwined and they're entangled. And therefore, it's a much more complex and powerful computer in some things. But I think that's something also really key to understand. And that, if you're going to the supermarket and you have a process and you're following that process, usually it will be just as efficient to just follow that process than trying to simultaneously find the pasta and the tomatoes and the salads at the same time, right? They're very different use cases. But if you're trying to research a library, for example, and find a specific piece of information in one of 500 books, it's much better to have 4 librarians running around and looking at things. So I do think that's also really useful for the audience to understand better. But maybe you can expand more on maybe some of the use cases of where a classical computer could be more useful. Maybe thinking about just generally various different components, if that's on your day-to-day life or as a more holistic piece.
Right. Yeah. So, I think you did make a good analogy there. If you think of a task that takes one man, let's say 100 minutes to complete. Obviously, if that man has to perform 100 times that same task, then that would be 10,000 minutes to complete, right? So in theory, if you had 100 men doing that task, then they could all do the task at the same time. And because it takes one man 100 minutes, then they would complete it instead of in 10,000 minutes, in 100 minutes, right? But you cannot get down the 100 minutes because that's the limit of how much the task actually takes, right? And so if you think about quantum computers, they're very good at these algorithms that can make a use of parallel thinking or parallel calculations. It's not entirely just parallel, but just to continue on that analogy, on tasks that are essentially different types of tasks that, the limiting factor is not the doing the tasks in parallel, but actually the time that it takes to do that one task. That's where classical machines are much better. Quantum computers are much more difficult to mass produce and get to the mass public. And yes, it's early days, but also because of their properties. Qubits are very susceptible to errors, and they can only operate if they're operating in a very cold environment, because they're very sensitive to any type of interference. And if you think about it, heat is actually one form of interference, right? So quantum computers actually only operate in very, very cold environments, really, really close to absolute zero. So actually, we can probably very confidently say that the coldest places in the universe are actually the housings where quantum computers reside. Maybe we could, if you just allow me one more minute of rambling, we could get into this. Quantum error correction is actually a good topic, because Willow, if it does one thing, is a breakthrough in quantum error correction, where it reduces the number of physical qubits needed per logical qubit, and I'll explain what this means, by nearly 40% compared to its predecessor, which was a chip called Sycamore. Now, what that means is, because qubits are very susceptible to errors, these systems rely on a lot of redundancy to operate effectively. So in other words, they use more than one physical qubit to form one logical qubit. Just to put it into context, it's estimated that to break RSA encryption, we would need actually thousands of logical qubits. And right now, Willow, the Google chip, is only I think it was 105 physical qubits. So, we're still far off from seeing the mass production of quantum computers, but it is obviously a breakthrough, and it added 5% to Google's share price in one day just after the announcement, and so that's worth right around $120 billion in market cap. So, it was quite a significant release by Google there.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with everything you've said, right? I think there have been some really great developments, but yeah, the challenges means that it's just not a usable, I guess, piece of technology yet, right? I mean, there's big focus on error correction and stability. The scalability you've mentioned are big concerns. Something I've been looking at to understand that a bit better, which I thought I might share with you and the audience, is why? What are some of the issues that actually, these, I guess, the conditions in which quantum computers need to reside, but also in terms of the actual scalability? What causes issues in terms of making that quite easily going from 5 to 10,000 to 10 million, let's say. So the first thing really interesting I saw was that I was speaking to somebody at CERN who, CERN is effectively the nuclear research facility in Switzerland, France, where they focus predominantly on effectively understanding the mysteries of the universe by doing all sorts of experiments. And they've been doing that for the last 30 years. And to do those experiments, actually, a lot of the technologies that they've had to innovate and create actually apply a lot to quantum computing, because they've had to be able to measure very, very granular particles at very, very precise times in very cold conditions. So actually, they, for the last 20 years, their Hadron Collider, in which they conduct most of the experiments, has been operating at between 3 and 5 Kelvin. So they've already managed to create some of those environments which actually Google and IBM are using. So they've worked with CERN, amongst other facilities, to actually develop the quantum experiments, which was quite interesting. And so one of the main focuses obviously is then this cryogenic cooling. How do you get to 5 degrees Kelvin, which is, for those who don't know what Kelvin is, it's 0 Kelvin, which is where particles stop moving, is minus 273 degrees Celsius. So we're talking about minus 268, minus 269 degrees Celsius, which is just unheard of, right? Like, where would you find that on this planet? Because, I mean, ice is minus 5, minus 10, right? So how do you get to those temperatures is really interesting. And so that's an ongoing discussion. But something that I didn't realize was a big focus is, to be able to scale, you need to be able to see that it's working, right? You need to be able to check that your quantum bits are correctly operating, that they're stable, that you don't have any critical hurdles to address. And something that was really interesting there is actually measuring the particles and how they're behaving at that level. And when you start adding more and more particles, how do you actually make sure that the quantum computer is actually working, right? And that's where the concept of time rationalization comes in, so that you can measure particles. But the confusing and complex part is that quantum particles, as you know, Juan, they can behave in different ways when you measure them to how they actually behave, which becomes then a very complex discussion, because you want to be able to measure that it's working without breaking the quantum aspect.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe just for the audience to understand this part as well, and let's not get into too much detail, because then we're going to start doing all sorts of conspiracy talk about are we living in a simulation or not, because this is really bonkers and it's very difficult to understand. It's, quantum physics is one of those things that the human brain is just not equipped to grasp. At least, I find it really, really hard to understand sometimes. But so what Dan was referring to actually is a very interesting point, which is that fundamentally particles that behave in quantum states, they, let's say, have quantum powers. So they behave more like a wave instead of a particle. However, when you try to locate it or, intercept it, just measure where the particle is, because remember, it's a wave, so it's a superposition of probabilities of where the particle will be. But the moment that you try to measure it, you intercept it, and it collapses, and now it stops behaving like a wave, and it starts behaving again like a particle. And actually, this brings up another interesting point, which is coherence time, which is another of the quantum properties that Google's Willow chip increases. And so what coherence time is the amount of time that a qubit behaves like a qubit before losing its quantum powers, so to speak, and then it just starts behaving like a normal classical bit, and then you just have a very expensive cryogenic but very small computer with 105 bits, essentially, right?
In other words, the world's smallest and most expensive fridge, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but what Google was able to do with this new quantum chip was to increase coherence times by 5, and so you can see how that allows people to run algorithms for longer, and we're talking about fractions of a second, actually. So I think coherence times currently are measured in microseconds. So if I'm not mistaken, that's 10 to the minus 6. So it's very, very marginal amounts of time that we have quantum computers operational and ready to be used. But yeah, okay, so we've only covered one prediction. Should we go to my first prediction for 2025?
Yeah, no, I think that sounds great. I mean, I guess you kind of brought in your prediction on quantum, right? So moving on, tell us more about your second prediction.
Right. So I think we need to mention AI. And in my view, 2025 is the litmus test for AI companies to justify the immense amounts of capex that has gone into building out the foundational infrastructure. So I do think that we will see AI agents and all the technology that goes in line with the rubber really hitting the road in 2025. And that's what everyone is predicting. And I think it is correct. In fact, I think that AI companies will start to forward integrate, and we will see them moving up the stack and into the application layer. But I'll go even further to say that I think it is fair to expect a commoditization of artificial intelligence, and if you think about it, a divergence between the commercialization of consumer technology and research. And if you think about it, then a collapse of the middle here. And I'll try to explain what I mean by this. So if you think about it, AI models are getting better and better, right? And this fundamental improvement in the underlying foundational models has been a key trend in 2024. I mean, you look at what we had at the start of the year. I think back then we were still either on ChatGPT 3.5 or maybe for Turbo, but not even ChatGPT 4.0. And you look at what we have now with some of these more advanced models like Gemini 2.0 or O1 and O3, the OpenAI models, which we can again talk a bit about later. And I think there's an evidential improvement, no question. But now you're starting to see a decline in the return of how much better the model gets for each incremental unit of training and resource cost. And you know, we've seen this cost of training really increase by several orders of magnitude, from hundreds of millions of dollars to train a model a few years ago, which was already a bonkers number back then, but now to even tens or hundreds, as I read the other day, of billions to train one single model.
Wow. What was that on? That's insane.
Yeah, exactly. It's so we're really getting into really large numbers, which is the reason why I think 2025 is the year where these companies really have to prove that it's worth to be spending that great amount of money to train a model, and they need to prove that they're making a return on that investment. But so back to what I was saying. I think, however, the reality is that most people, right, and most use cases do not require more than PhD level intelligence. And so I think 2025 will be the year where the trend will continue to commodity, general purpose models that will be used by the vast majority. And these will for sure keep improving moderately in performance, but especially in efficiency. And then on the other hand, I think there will still be a huge push in frontier AI models that will become larger and exponentially more expensive, that may be used for complex scientific purposes, governments, military applications. And in this pursuit of what people are calling ARC-AGI, right? Artificial General Intelligence. I think that's even outdated now, and people are starting to talk about artificial ASI, artificial super intelligence. What I mean by the collapse of the middle is that I don't think that there will be much will from the market to pay hundreds or even thousands of dollars a month for that in-between technology, to answer simple questions like, help me plan a trip to Argentina, or help me answer this particular high school question, whatever it may be, which is, 99% of the queries that people are using ChatGPT for, even in enterprise. So my prediction is that I just think that the technology that we have today is already good enough for that, and that alone will not justify that $100 billion to train a model, and that we will see a more laser focus on improving efficiency instead.
No, I think that's a great one, Juan. It's very interesting because actually my prediction on AI was very similar, but from a very different angle. So my prediction for 2025 was that for a lot of businesses, there will be a much bigger focus on the education and reducing some of those barriers that might be existing in terms of people being scared of AI, let's say replacing their job, to making it more of a normal thing that people use, using these general models, right? I'm not talking about super specific models which need to be really, really educated, but actually focusing more on the impacts, right? I think according to the World Economic Forum, 97 million jobs are going to be created by 2025 in terms of AI related roles, right? So there's a huge focus there on things like prompt engineering, which means people basically using AI to find the answers through documents and things. So that I find is really, really interesting. And it's quite interesting to see that you're touching on it more from the return on investment side, because those things come hand in hand, that people are starting to think, right, well, actually, let's focus on getting people to use it, because that's the real unlock. I think McKinsey said that effectively using AI properly can increase the productivity of a workforce by 20 to 30% in one of their transformation reports published not too long ago. So it's a very interesting one. And it's quite interesting to hear your thoughts from that return perspective. What do you think will be, if they're not spending all of this money in terms of CapEx on building the next big model, what do you think will be some of the bigger focuses for somebody like OpenAI or, Anthropic or one of these larger AI players?
I think these large frontier companies like the OpenAIs of the world and the Googles of the world, I think they're going to start going up the chain and go into the application layer, right? So what I mean by that is instead of them just relying on the underlying model and providing that simple interface to ChatGPT to consumer and the API to the developers, I think they will develop their own applications as well. So that goes a bit in line with also this thought that the trend will continue to be hyper specialization in AI models, where you will see models that are much more efficient, only trained on a particular use case, but very good at that use case, right? So hyper specialized versus these monoliths. I think there will still be a push towards that fancy word AGI, and let's get into it next. But I think the key, especially for the governments, it's something that people need to realize. The real breakthrough from AI comes from the implementation strategy, the mass implementation of AI in the workforce and in the population, rather than by building the most intelligent model ever. And so actually, this is a good segue to talk about a news article, and I'll pose it as a question for you, Dan. I saw very recently an article, and actually there was an Twitter X post written about it. And this woman was saying, and I'll read word for word, O3 has scored over 85% on ARC-AGI, right? Which is a test, and O3 is the model that had been released by OpenAI in experimental mode, let's say, to a few researchers. And she says human performance is at 85%. In other words, AGI has been achieved in 2024. 2025 is going to be wild. And so I think we need to clear up the terminology here, Dan. So
I was about to say, yeah.
Why don't you explain to our audience what people mean when they say AGI?
So to start with, AGI refers to, it's an acronym, and it refers to artificial general intelligence. How do I put this? We're not talking here about an ex machina or an iRobot, but we're talking about something that thinks similarly to a human, right? So some common sense, reasoning, an ability to learn, adapt, and face, I guess, new challenges and situations. I think that's what we would refer to as humans, as general intelligence, right? If you came across an alien species, you'd expect that of a generally intelligent being, and the same applies to AI, because we're talking about effectively something that is not human, that can think of the world in a similar way to a human. Now, the other side of it is, of course, the ARC. And I think maybe if you want to touch on that, Juan, but I think something important is ARC stands for abstraction and reasoning corpus. But can you explain maybe a bit more what that means in terms of the actual tests, etc.?
Yeah. So essentially, there was this news article that was published, I think it was now a few weeks ago, on O3 breaking a world record in this particular test. And people were using that to say, yeah, AGI is around us, and AGI this and AGI that. And this term really gets thrown around a lot. I think it's good to clear the air first about what AGI really means. And so I think we shouldn't forget that fundamentally, how these LLMs, large language models that are the basis of what your AI systems work, they're not more than very good prediction machines, right? So they work by getting a bunch of context. So they're very good at looking at a piece of text and predicting what the next most probable word in the sequence will be, which is mind-boggling. Like, when did we even think about this technology? And it just turns out that as you scale and as you give them training data, these systems get better and better. But what is interesting, and I think makes more sense, it's easier to grasp. Broadly speaking, if you think about it in this way, an AI system may be able to beat you at chess, right? I haven't actually tried to play chess with ChatGPT, but I can assume it's probably a lot better than me. Not that it's particularly difficult. But the important bit here is that the AI system is only predicting the next word. So so if you think about it, it can beat a human at chess, but it doesn't even understand why it's playing chess in the first place. And so I think we should take that into account, because with the release of these new models, if you have tried them, they're really good. These chain of thought reasoning models. And here the choice of words is, again, unfortunate, because they are not reasoning. They're just doing the exact same predictions, just with extra prompts in between. But it's actually very difficult to measure how intelligent an AI system is. I think the it's not the right framework. I don't know if you have the same feeling as me, Dan.
No, I definitely agree. And I think that comes back to actually part of the reason I came up with my hypothesis in terms of the usage of AI and that becoming a big focus of 2025. I think the important thing is to bear in mind that the reality is we're talking about very advanced machine learning, right? So it's very, very good at sifting through data. In this case, it's words, and then coming up with the answers. But that's what it does. It isn't a brain connected to a laptop or to some servers, and then it shoots out, it's the all-knowing godly human. That's not what the AI that we use. That's not what LLMs are actually, how they think or how they're wired. I think that's a really big focus, because what that means in terms of people and people using AI is that these technologies are only as strong and only as good as the person who understands that context, understands the actual prompt that they're looking for, the exact information, the context of the environment, and therefore exactly the wording to get the right answers is really important with this current technology. And when we move on to the next phase of AI, to natural language models, that's when we can start, really thinking about, okay, is it human intelligence? And even defining what human intelligence is, right? Is it IQ? What about EQ? What about the importance of culture, right? There was a huge ethical debate in electric cars where if you've got an old woman and a kid on the street, should you kill the kid or the old woman? And if you ask different cultures, different people, you'd get different answers. No technology will ever give you an all-knowing answer, because there's so much more to it than just what meets the eye, right? If in China you can say, or I think it was Japan actually, you should respect the elder, you should let the elder live, but in a lot of Western countries it was save the kid. It's quite an interesting example, right, of how actually, and in that case I think it is AI enhanced, because it was like a Tesla, right, with using facial recognition software to recognize that kind of scenario. So it's a very interesting debate, but I think that's a really important one, because people talk so much about, like you said, oh, it's effectively a robot, it just doesn't have legs yet, it doesn't do my job yet. But that's not true. It's like a dishwasher. You got to turn it on. You got to tell it what to do. But very fancy dishwasher.
Exactly, which actually brings me to another interesting point, which is, if AGI is a term that fundamentally doesn't mean anything, that doesn't mean that in the hands of someone with nefarious intentions, for example, that it could be dangerous. So, Dan, let me pose a question to you. When do we pull the plug? When do we think AI systems have gotten too powerful for us to continue using them? And is there even a mechanism that we can just pull the plug?
I always like to look at history when it comes to that. That's a very interesting question, Juan. And I think the important thing is to look back at big moments like this in history, right? When we've actually created technologies which were so irreversible that the impacts could have been catastrophic to the planet, and what has happened in reality. When I say that, I mean, a good example would be nuclear bombs, right? And actually, before we got to nuclear bombs, there was a huge amount of focus on nuclear research to actually effectively create out of matter pure energy, right? Coming back to your point on Einstein, right? The famous equation E equals mc squared, which is effectively that you could create pure energy out of matter. And there was a good movie that came out, which I recommend for anybody who hasn't watched it yet. Oppenheimer kind of covers a lot of this. Is effectively the US built an atomic bomb which took this technology, which was intended to be used for the good of the world, of creating energy production and reducing the strains on natural resources, to effectively weaponize it and test it out. And Hiroshima was the unfortunate victim of testing this bomb. And after that, we saw a huge nuclear arms race, which even now today, a lot of the world leaders have access to. So on one side, the ability to look at nuclear energy and produce nuclear reactors was something really great for humanity as a whole, right? It reduced our focus on crude oil. It provided energy to boost industrial revolutions, to effectively improve people's health, people's wealth across the entire planet. So those are really great things and helped us fundamentally understand the world a bit better. But on the flip side, there will always be the possibility of quite counter negative impacts. And I saw an interesting interview with the CEO of NVIDIA, where this was a big discussion point. And I think the reality is that it's unknown, but his take on it was that he would hope that people would use it for the better. But the great thing is that in the right hands, a lot of the preemptive technologies to reduce the risk of AI being used in warfare by terrorist organizations could be preempted by security organizations in government, but also in the private sector around the world. And I think that applies to cybersecurity, hacking, all sorts of attacks on people, institutions around the world. So I'm personally more of an optimist, and I think that, yes, the nuclear arms race, for example, could have led to World War III and the annihilation of our planet, but it didn't. And I think the AI as a whole is a pivotal point for us as a society, as humans, to actually work a bit more together and to effectively focus on the better aspects of what this technology can bring. And for those unfortunate instances where it's being weaponized or used for the wrong reasons, we protect ourselves as well. And I think that is what it seems people are focusing on. What do you think, Juan?
That's a much more comprehensive view. I guess here is where we can really see our backgrounds. I was going to approach it in a more engineering-like fashion, where I was going to say that essentially these AI systems, they're running on really large supercomputer clusters, right? So data centers. And so there's actually a physical cable that you can pull. So here's my engineering take on it. When AI systems start, and again, I do believe that 2025 will be the year of AI agents. So when these agents start communicating with each other in ways that we don't understand anymore, in languages that imagine these systems decide that they're going to come up with their own language because our way of communicating is not the most efficient. And they start communicating in a language that they only understand. And we stop seeing what they are trying to do, what goals they're trying to reach. In that moment, there and then, we know that we've lost control. And like I said in my latest Substack post, I ended the article saying, and we can only pray that whoever is in charge of this technology just pulls the plug. I think that's a good way to end this section on AI with my more practical engineering view and Dan's more comprehensive historical view.
I like that one.
But why don't we get into another prediction? Did you have another prediction for 2025 prepared?
I mean, I think that we've talked a lot about technology, right? I'm not sure if it's a prediction of sorts, but it was more just generally New Year resolutions, and it's an interesting time to reflect on those because it's the start of a new year. It's the 1st of Jan, and I think a lot of people have set out different resolutions across the world. Now, personally, I've never been a big believer in New Year resolutions, so I guess I wouldn't expect. I guess one of my predictions is we're going to be seeing a lot of, if that's with friends or family or on the internet, all sorts of new people trying new things for the next few weeks. But my prediction is that 2 words will not be one of those short-lived 2 weeks sorts of vocations. So that would be my prediction for 2025, Juan.
Right. Okay. I think that's a fair way to put it. I was curiously also never a believer in resolutions. I am going to try it out this year, where actually my girlfriend has asked me if we can spend some time and document our New Year's resolutions, and I think it might be a cool exercise to start thinking more strategically about what we're doing. This podcast will be certainly on that list, and I also agree. I don't think it's going to be short-lived. I don't think if anyone is going to have reached this far in the episode. If you have, maybe write it on down in the comment section, and make sure to support us in whichever way you can. But that's not the reason why I'm doing this. I think it also is going to help me really, structure my views, form opinions about things, and I'm super excited. And even if no one ends up listening to us, I will still do it, just because I think taking a time for a chat, and especially with you, Dan, is always really interesting and insightful. I do have one more prediction, though, that I wanted to touch on before we go into that last section. We've prepared a little surprise section at the end that I'll let Dan introduce later. My final prediction that I wanted to get into for 2025 is actually a bit depressing. And, it is definitely a topic that we could go deeper on in future episodes. Of course, if we prepared some structured material also for the audience here. I think 2025 is the year also where we start seeing a clear decadence of the European Union. Okay, so let me pull up a quick chart here. And if we stay on economics for a second, if you can look at the graph there, you can see that the gap between the EU and the US's GDP per capita has kept growing over the years. And it is now roughly 27% below the US. And actually, according to Bloomberg, if the EU had kept up with the growth pace of the US's economy in the past few decades, Europe would be putting on $3 trillion per year onto the economy, which, for reference, is roughly about the size of the economy of France. To put that into context, with Trump and the consequent American protectionism that he will bring, we've all heard a million times that his favorite word is the word tariff, right? Well, it turns out that the EU is a net exporter of manufactured goods, machinery, vehicles in particular, especially in Germany, which we have seen how bad that's getting with some of the mass layoffs in groups like VW. If you couple that with increased military spending, also pushed by Trump on NATO, and the rise of anti-European parties all across Europe, we're seeing what's happening in Germany, the collapse of the government in France. My prediction is that 2025 will be an even tougher year for the EU. And it actually ties back quite nicely into what we were discussing earlier about AI, and the point that I briefly brought up, where I said, I think that the way to win the race for AI supremacy is by making sure that you have mass adoption of the technology, and essentially the country that is capable of adapting quicker, like oftentimes we see in history, will be the country that will take on the hegemony of global order going forward. And going back to that chart, the EU hasn't been able to keep up with US productivity. And that has a lot to do with hyperregulation and ease of implementation of new technology. And AI is, one of the most important disruptors of productivity that we have today. And so Europe have to really get it together and tackle hyperregulation like they're doing in the US with this DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, if we don't want to end up at the back of the queue. I don't know, I think, Dan, what you think about this topic. I know it's a dense topic. We can probably do a whole episode about just this, but maybe just give me your views on this.
No, I mean, I pretty much agree, Juan. I think it's very much obvious that, there have been various faults in terms of the European Union's ability, or Europe as a whole actually, ability to develop and produce economic value in comparison to some of the BRIC nations, in comparison to the US, and definitely overregulation is a component. They're arguable components that everybody will continue to debate for the next 100 years on culture as well, right? Where do we have in Europe a Silicon Valley sort of hub? We're talking also about, in terms of innovation and trying new things, right? There's the element of work ethic as well. And in terms of, there's been a big focus in Europe on reducing working hours, improving people's rights when it comes to work and labor law enforcement. So, and that kind of ties into overregulation. But as a whole, I think it's a bigger piece than just some officials putting in some regulations. And fundamentally, I think something 2025 and onwards is what role will Europe play in the world stage, right? The Middle East is starting to do very well and attracting a lot of people there. Purchasing power is much higher in the US, but in Europe we're starting to see the impact of inflation, right? But low wage increases really starting to affect the local populations. So that, especially in urban places, as we know in London, right? The prices of things have skyrocketed in comparison to wage increases. So it's a very interesting time, and especially what the European Union is and represents is a big question mark, right? Does it represent France's interest in agriculture and Germany's interests in the automotive industry, or is it a bigger piece? Is it actually all for one for all Europe mentality? I think those are things that people will continue to discuss and debate. But if you're starting to see that the German market and automotive sector, their main focus of their economy, is struggling, the fact that they're building up their army again after, since 1944 of not having an army for various obvious reasons, starts putting things into perspective a bit on where is the world going, the politics as well, what people are feeling. I don't think there's an answer that we have, but I think it doesn't look good, would be my summary.
Right. Dan, maybe for the audience as well, you have a German background as well, right? What's the sentiment there in Germany with regards to the European Union?
So I think, generally speaking, Angela Merkel was one of the big advocates of the European Union and somebody who was in office for a very long time as the Chancellor of Germany, which is a very important position. And effectively, there was a big focus there and actually a lot of pride associated with the European Union. So there was a huge focus there on unification and bringing Europe together. And part of that is driven by the actual general population wanting to be part of something bigger. The automotive industry back in 2010 doing quite well and actually trying to get those exports across the Schengen area and access to the ports, as Germany has minor access to the ports when compared to the production sides of the automotive sector. But also it's a bigger picture, right? Like Angela Merkel, she came from Eastern Germany before the unification when the wall was broken down in Berlin. So there was also a personal agenda about unifying the world, healing Germany. So that's something that's always been a big focus. But I would very much say the German population is very proud about their automotive sector. People spend a significant proportion of their disposable income and wealth on actual cars and locally manufactured cars. So you do see that as a big status symbol in Germany. And it's always a big focus in the news. There's a news show that everybody watches that at 8 p.m. every day. And it talks about the automotive industry and then some other stuff, right? Basically. So it is a big conversation, especially the 3 factories that were closed down not too long ago. That is a very big conversation and worry for other manufacturing industries which are closely aligned or companies which are associated with that industry as a whole. Because if that doesn't do well, then the German GDP goes down, basically.
Right. Dan, very, very interesting. For anyone that's wondering, Dan actually grew up in Germany. I'm Spanish myself, so I can certainly speak to the Spanish people. In Spain, you're also seeing the rise of anti-European movements, for sure. So I just really think that in 2025, we're only going to see these movements increase. And especially with the economic pressures that will be put on the EU, especially by the Trump administration, and with all of the geopolitical turmoil that affects Europe directly, especially the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I think it's going to be a tough year for the European Union. And actually, I was seeing this video the other day that was talking about this, and I think that it's a true point. If you think about the world stage and you think about the representatives of the global powers, you know that Russia is represented by Putin. You know that Xi represents China. Now Trump will very strongly represent the US. But who represents Europe? In the past it was Merkel, but now there's no clear leader, right? Macron is out of the question now. And what's her name? Ursula von der Leyen?
Von der Leyen. Yeah,
is she German or is she German?
She's Dutch. She's Dutch.
She's Dutch. Actually. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, again, I don't think even half of Europe would see her as Europe's representative. When there's a deal to be made and a discussion to be had, who is going to be the clear leader and representative of Europe's interest? I think that's a question that remains unanswered. And I do hope that the EU really gets their stuff together, let's put it that way, and puts a plan forward for 2025 and beyond. Dan, why don't we end this episode with the section that we had come up with?
Absolutely, Juan. So I think something that we've not addressed on purpose for this episode has been why the name. Obviously, we've talked about our story, but 2 words is more than just a name, right? It's an anecdote. And I think that's what we wanted to introduce for everybody, as this is our first episode. And we will continue to reintroduce for our new listeners, is effectively this concept of 2 words. So we wanted to take away each episode's two main points, 2 main words that really stuck from our discussion for our listeners. As we know, not all of the information will necessarily stick, and it's easier to focus on some key points. And we might, play around with this or adapt this.
Yeah. Do we want to get into? I mean, very briefly, just explain for our audience here why we decided to come up with the name 2 words. I'll just give my view because it's easier from my perspective. But basically, there's this very stupid but really, really good game on Nintendo Switch, and it's called Boomerang Fu. It's our first episode, so we aren't sponsored. But if someone from Boomerang Fu is watching, then you have to be our top sponsor here. Come on. But anyway, so we really got hooked into this stupid game a few months ago, and Dan would come down from work, and we would hang out in the living area. And at some stage in the night after we had dinner, Dan would always turn to me and just say 2 words, and those 2 words were Boomerang Fu, and that would mean that we ended up playing on those nights until midnight, having to work the next day, trying to defeat a very stupid bot with a banana costume. It's really, we really have to play that game live one day because it would be really funny. But anyway, yeah. So that's a bit of the backstory, and so we thought that we would end each episode with our 2 words of the week, or 2 words that we take away from the conversation. Dan, do you want to start with your 2 words?
That's a difficult one. I think it's going to be a difficult one to do, Juan, but I'll give it my best. I mean, I really enjoyed our conversation on quantum and AI, and of course, the future of Europe. But I think my main 2 focus area, my main area that I'd like to focus on, considering also, going into the next year and new year, I think the big one for me personally, but also as a whole, is this whole discussion on AI. And I think it is powerful, and in one word, right? the use of AI is going to be a powerful place for us as a human generation. But the other part I would say is there are also challenges. So powerful and challenges are my two words. I don't think that AI is as intelligent as a human. I think there is education still to be done for humans as a whole to be using AI. And there are a lot of advancements and arguably also challenges with their use cases in terms of what you talked about, in terms of when do you pull the plug. I think those would be my main takeaways. How about you, Juan?
I have taken a slightly different approach. Should I tell what you told me through WhatsApp the other day when we came up with this section?
Absolutely.
Because those words are actually the most appropriate in especially today. So Dan actually, when we started talking about this section, said, "Oh, I already have my two words for the episode. It has to be Happy New Year." Oh, that's three words. But I guess we can summarize it in Happy 2025. Those would qualify as two words. My two words of the discussion would be inflection point. I think 2025 is really going to be an inflection point for the global stage in all of the topics that we will discuss on this podcast. So everything from technology to business, economics. But then I think also personally for us, and I think I can speak for both of us when I say that we're very excited to kick this off in the new year and really look forward to sharing our experience with all of our audience here. So excited that we are filming at 2 a.m. on now the 2nd of January, right? So with that, I think I'm going to go to bed. Dan, I don't know about you, but yeah, thank you for the conversation. It's been very interesting. I think we have a very good thing going on here, and I look forward to our next episode.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you to our viewers.